few years back, my BFF showed up and announced that she was now a beatboxer. She proved this by bouncing her body back and forth while spouting out the words boots and cats regularly at different intervals. Now I'm going to give you a minute to think about that for yourself. Try it out. Boots and cats. Boots and cats and boots and cats and cats and boots. Congratulations, you are now also a rapper. Sort of. And I think this is exactly what befalls a number of branding projects. Hi, I'm Amy Jackson, creative director, award-winning designer, color nerd, and unapologetic brand evangelist. And this is Brand is Not a Four-Letter Word. Today, let's talk about why I think brand gets that bad rap, if you will, and what to do about it. In the last episode, we covered how nuanced the topic of branding can be and the challenge to define exactly what it is, so I'd like to harken back to my favorite Michael Eisner quote. He says, "A brand is a living entity, and it is enriched or undermined cumulatively over time, the product of 1,000 small gestures." I love it every time I read it. Enriched or undermined. He says it right there. It's enriched or undermined cumulatively over time. I think we can all probably cite examples of undermining a brand from a social or a communication misstep. Maybe it's just often repeated experiences that didn't live up to our expectations. But hey, Michael also says that a brand is a living entity, and what other living entity can't relate, right? The problem is, though, that for a brand, there's so much more at stake than the average human who just might have a bad day in communicating. So that's why there's such an incredible need for a strong alignment between a brand's promise, its marketing, and its experience. Let's head back to my propensity to look for definitions in order to understand things. Today, I collected the promise, marketing, and experience definitions from branding expert and author Scott Lerman in his book, Building Better Brands. And let me read now. The brand promise is defined as the expectations created about the product, organization, or person. The brand's promise sets a standard for the public to judge value. Expectation created, that's probably by design, the product, organization, or person. It's the brand's promise that sets the standard for public to judge the value. I like to think about Staples. So if you aren't in an area where there is a Staples, you may not know that it's your basic office supply store. But Staples created a different promise. They said, sure, it's a commodity. So many others have these same items, but we make it easy. And they created an entire campaign around the idea that you could just tap an easy button. And there were all these different circumstances that someone was stressed out, there wasn't enough time, they needed these elements, something that was wholly relatable, right? Because you're trying to make the most of every business minute spent, and you need these tools, but who has time to stop and make sure you always have them? Well, Staples makes it easy. You just tap a button. That was their promise. Marketing. Scott says that's strategic, designed influences of the brand's perception and promise. So yes, logos are part of a brand. Color palettes, I love them, part of a brand. Fonts, voice, sound, design assets, campaigns, positioning, messaging, all of that is part of a brand. It just all too often is thought of as the only parts of a brand. Let's think about this. Can you hear me now? That was Verizon's marketing around their promise. Of course, their promise was that they were such a wide network that they had towers so many places that they were the better person to choose, the better brand to align with, because you may not be able to make that connection with your important people if you pick a different provider. But Verizon, you can be heard anywhere. That was their promise. They created marketing around that, and they used it so well that the campaign, Can You Hear Me Now, worked even after that actor left. When his contract expired and then his non-compete expired, and he showed up on a different provider's commercials, their marketing, you still had it in your brain, Can you hear me now? Now, did that work better for the new provider or Verizon? That's for the public to decide. But the campaign proved that marketing was effective when it was on brand and fulfilled that promise. And then the experience. You may be thinking, I'm not sure we need Scott to define a brand experience. We get it. But here's what I like about it. He says what actually happens, which is what any of us could have said. But he also says, and the expectations that it will happen to the same degree of success again in the future. Well, that makes an experience a little bit more important. We can't just have one good one. We have to continually having consistently good experiences that align with that brand promise in the future. When I think about Apple, my heart soars. I'm a creative. I can't help it. Of course I have everything. I love Macs. I love phones. I love all of those items. But what I really loved was how they were designed. And you know, back in the day when we were all first learning this new technology, this new functionality, there was a real push with Apple to make sure that things felt real. Steve Jobs actually sent out some memos about how important design was. He embodied it into the experience that everyone had internally and externally. There's some lore about one of those memos being how he wanted to have the notes icon replicate a part of what the leather looked like in his boat. So when you think about that original icon, you remember how it had the brown leather with the stitching across the top? He wanted things to look real and feel real because he knew that we were all having a learning curve into a new dynamic. And of course, there became a day where that was no longer as important. And Apple introduced flat design, and that stitching and that leather went away. But by then we'd adopted new understandings. We could find the notes icon without it looking like that. We could see value in stripping those elements away. And that was fine. Now, yes, it absolutely created some feelings for and against, but the experience itself remained the same, right? Yes, some of the design assets shifted and evolved as they should be able to. The marketing did as well, but the promise remained the same. And the experience remained the same as well. When you think about going into an Apple store, it still has the same vibe. When you pick up your Apple phone, you still know how to operate it. You have the experience over and over to the same degree of success. So these three components create a strong brand when they're in sync. But when they're siloed and not fulfilling each other, then it doesn't work. Strong brands have to have these three things combined. Its mission and its values, which is an admittedly high level and somewhat incomplete view of a brand promise, is just as important as its marketing. Now, we all know the old product, price, place, promotion, right? That's what makes up marketing. How we select a brand's strategic positioning matters. The tone and the voice that have strategically been decided on. Its messaging, how we craft calls to actions, engagements. And finally, the brand's experience. Again, what actually happens, or more clearly, how it's perceived in that communication loop we talked about last episode. Do you remember that? We talked about how whenever we have something really important to communicate, or mundane, or exciting, no matter what it is that we need to say, it has to filter through our internal noise, then cross through external noise, be absorbed into our target audience's internal noise, filter through before it can be received, perceived, and responded to in that exact same manner. And so as we are in this communication loop, it can be challenging for any living entity. Okay, but when it's not just two humans, but an entire demographic or demographics plural who have their own perceptions and noise and expectations filtering through and continuing to circulate, well, that feels like a lot to put on a brand, sure. But that's actually the whole reason for its existence. We can create a brand so that it can hold up through that cycle, so that it can fulfill the promise it's making, so that it can support those calls to action, so it sounds authentic and the experience is exactly what's expected every single time. One might even say through 1,000 small gestures. But that's exactly why these three components can't act in silos, and why often brand projects that often skim the surface, that focus only on logos or even my beloved color palettes, can fall short. And once again, when something falls short, it's not that far of a leap to failure. That's generally when the cursing starts. So then how do we align these three things? The brand's promise, its marketing, and its experience. There's the challenge indeed. It takes everyone being in alignment. Marketing and creative can't own the brand in a silo, but neither can customer service or operations drive it wholly. The dev team, leadership, nobody, no single person, no team, no one department can create or evolve a brand alone. If you're a mom and pop shop, it often might need to be including your vendor partners. It will always include the tools that you use to do business, whether you're a solopreneur or a billion-dollar brand. Here's a little sneak peek. In our next episode, we're going to talk about how your brand has to be actionable, aspirational, and authentic in order to align your brand's promise, marketing, and experience in a unique way. But here's today's brand hack, and it's a simple 2-question quiz. Ask yourself first, then ask your people. First question is just this. Can everyone inside your organization articulate your brand's promise? Everyone. Receptionist to controller. Can everyone inside your organization articulate what it is that your organization is promising? I used to work at the YMCA, and there was a well-known fact that our CEO would walk around with $5 bills in his pocket. One time I was at a branch, and I saw him show up, and sure enough, he went to the front desk person who reported to me, and he asked them, "Can you tell us our mission statement?" Now, for the YMCA, that was the promise. It wasn't just something that was on a website. We absolutely also put it on walls, but we also put it on the footers of our agendas, and we gave ourselves little cards, and a new hire was always encouraged to memorize it as quickly as possible. We actually even quoted it amongst ourselves in group meetings. I know that feels more like the Boy Scouts with the quoting and things, but we really did because we wanted that brand promise, that mission that we were all supposed to march behind, to be something that dwelled within us, that we didn't have to stop and think about, because then when we made those decisions, it was already there innately in our muscle memory. So our CEO encouraged that, and sure enough, when my front desk worker was able to quote the mission statement perfectly, he received a $5 bill. And I would say that the value was far better than the cost. Does that promise ring true to your internal and external audiences? Because that's the second question. Question 1, can everyone inside your organization articulate your brand promise? Question true, does that promise ring true to your internal and external audiences? Because the fact of the matter is, experience begins with culture. Culture influences brand, and brand can drive culture. It's a loop, a promise, an experience, and the marketing that delivers both in an authentic, actionable, and aspirational way builds a strong foundation. Because brand isn't a 4-letter word. It's your best strategy and your strongest story. Let's build your brand together. Learn more at brandisnotafourletterword.com, where strategy and storytelling meet design.